Now let's get to something new.
You mentioned that you were interested in the science and thinking about science, so I'm interested in hearing more about what's on your mind.
Okay, I'll tell you what's on my mind. What we've been doing ever since the Industrial Revolution got started is making substitutions. Machines for people, chemicals for people, and so on down the line, until we really have gotten rid of the farming population. There are good things happening, and we could make a list. I mean, farmers markets, local economy efforts, and so on, that are heartening, but only a minuscule acreage is involved. And most of the economic landscapes of the country are given over to what we call best practices, which means they're being ruined. Best practices recommended by the Extension Service, the universities, the government, and all that. No-till, for instance, does not stop soil erosion under continuous cultivation, not in river bottoms. So, Wes Jackson talks about the eyes to acres ratio, by which he means that any place in human use needs to be attentively watched over, cared for, competently watched over by people who know what they're seeing. And I'm reckoning at home with the disappearance of the native black willows from along the shore of my river. The big decline, if not the disappearance, of the muskrats. Why? You can't find out. Nobody's looking. I've approached people, conservationists, biologists, and so on, for the last 12 years, asking them, why did the black willows disappear? Except for a few old fishermen that I've blunder into anyway, I haven't found anybody who knew they'd disappeared until I said so. Nobody's watching. Nobody's out there. The young people are not playing in the countryside, let alone working in it. They're watching screens to get ready for the world of tomorrow, in exile from the world of today. Their great gift given to them in the liveliest years of their lives. They're sitting there looking at a damn screen. Or, as my school teacher granddaughter says, sex takes up a lot of time. I said, how can sex take up a lot of time? Oh, she says, arranging for it by telecommunications, you know.
I didn't know my question was going there.
I'm sorry.
I didn't know my question was going there.
Well, your question goes to everything. So, what have you come to when you're reduced to calling up experts to find out what's happening in your river? We've substituted science for the human presence in the human economy, the human economic landscapes. There isn't enough science to go around. Most scientists I've talked to don't even know anything about my river, and it's a major waterway in the state. They don't know anything. But science does what it's paid to do. Science serves the government. We know what that means when the government is owned lock, stock, and barrel by the corporations. Science in the universities is dependent on grants. You can't get a grant to look into the disappearance of the willows on the lower Kentucky River. Nobody's going to do it. So, that's a dilemma. It's a very big dilemma, and I'm raising the question, haven't we about run to the end of this possibility of substitution? Virtual reality for reality it's come to, you know. For all I know, virtual sex for sex, but I'm not going to know about that, I reckon. So, what I'm saying is, I think you've got to quit picking at these, I think we have got to quit picking at issues as if the industrial economy can be fixed somehow by more technology, which is always recommended, more research. I don't think it can be fixed that way. I think we've got to get our pry bar in under the whole pile, which is to say the whole industrial enterprise, because it can't be fixed on its own terms. There's nothing in the free market that will resolve these issues. There's no language in free market economics that can ask the questions.
One of the tensions that I think about is with the ways that technology can improve people's lives. So I had a friend who taught at a deaf school. She was around a lot of deaf students. And texting and video conferencing has improved their lives dramatically. They can get medical specialists that they, and a sign language interpreter that they can understand, and they can communicate with their siblings and things like that. And it seems like capitalism does a good job at technological innovation, at amassing capital to do something big. And sometimes those things can help people's lives. I think about that tension a lot.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I'm not saying we can undo it. You can't. We can only start from where we are, which is in the depths of the industrial phenomenon, which is pretty young, actually. So people are always saying, well, what about painless dentistry? Well, what about it? Anybody who's had it without the painlessness is grateful for it. There's nobody, I don't know anybody who isn't in some way indebted to the medical industry. When I am, people in my family are. And yet we have to understand that it's an industry. And one of the things that happens in an industry is that you don't get cheap solutions. You're going to get a technological solution that's going to cost money, and the medical industry's solutions are driving us into terrible dilemmas. What do you say to a family who wants to keep its brain-dead daughter alive at great expense and at great cost to their hearts and souls and minds? I mean, they're rim-wracked when they go through these things. And some physicians know it and are deeply worried about it. What I think we have to do, for one thing, is we've got to change the standards. Profit and mechanical efficiency are not going to do it for us. We've got to get somehow a standard like ecological health that enfolds very readily a concept of neighborliness. We've got to learn to make judgments on the basis of that. We've got to learn again to subtract. What does painless dentistry cost us? And we've got to remember that people suffered before painless dentistry, suffered dentistry, or suffered the lack of it. I don't know. I don't know how you quantify this sort of thing and deal with it, but we can say what it's costing and what we get for what we've paid. Those questions need to be asked. So you see, what I'm doing here is outlining my own dilemma, my own ignorance. I didn't come here with a kit of answers to give out to the fortunate young people.
About the role of a teacher a bit in talking about men who collect facts often aren't affiliated with any sense of place. I'm just wondering if you can speak to if many of us in this room hope to teach or are teaching, and if you could speak to what you mean by rekindling that light of affection, is particularly in a culture with technology as it is humming and busy, and there's almost this numbness that I see with my students, in part because of they're not being connected to place. How to think about rekindling when it doesn't always seem like there's a lot of attentiveness to begin with?
You know, I don't know that there's a formula for that. That's hard. How do you get people to have a life that isn't prescribed or sold to them by somebody with this equipment to sell? And I don't know. I think a lot about biology teachers and our great need for good field biologists, or naturalists we used to call them, good all-around naturalists who would be the Pied Pipers in these dreadful schools and get these kids out on foot in their home watershed or bioregion or the local creek valley, and look around and say the names of the creatures that they see and say, these are your neighbors. What's your relationship with these creatures? Or show them what's beautiful. I mean, what's the thing? There are things that are obviously beautiful, extremely beautiful, lavishly beautiful. They don't cost a thing. Butterflies. Suppose you've got kids who have never seen one, because they've never looked at one. Flowers. Those little pretty birds. I don't know what I would do if I were a school teacher. I have an Amish friend who had one teacher who took them out and showed them the butterflies and the caterpillars and the cocoons and so on, and got them so they could see. I learned to squirrel hunt from a black man who would find the squirrel and then wait for me to see it with a grin on his face. He taught me to see. But my answer is I don't know. That's a good question. But I think a lot of good depends on people being able to entertain those questions, to suffer them years on end. That'll keep you alive if you do that at a cost. Now, I think education is largely being oversold and pretty badly underperformed in universities. What they don't say, we now call them educators, teachers, but educator got one more syllable, so it's people call Jesus a teacher. Buddha was a teacher, but that's not good enough for us. We've got to be educators. What we don't confess is that it's chance, luck, fortune, those things are involved. Not every teacher is right for every student. If you go through a long education and find a handful, I always think about Sodom and Gomorrah when I think about this. For what would I spare the educational system? Well, for 5 teachers, my impression is, by thinking of my own experience as a student and teacher, if you can get through 12 to 20 years of education and find 5 really good teachers who are going to be on your mind for the rest of your life, asking you questions, saying you can do better, you're really lucky. You've really lucked out. Most teachers are thrust into the role of disciplinarians, jailers, babysitters. And how do you make use of that? Well, some people are inventive and good, and some are just not. And I don't know. That's my fallback position. Ignorance.
When you moved back to Kentucky, I would assume that it was a fair amount driven by affection for place and a desire to be rooted. How has your affection for this place grown and expanded and changed since coming back?
Oh, it really has. When we moved back to Kentucky, it was in 1964. I was 30 years old. I thought that was pretty old. But it's easy for me to allow people to assume that I knew what I was doing. I was under the rule of affection. I wanted to come back. And I was fortunate to have married a girl who would let me, who would give me permission to do it, who would come with me. She lived all over the place. I forget how many schools, 20 maybe or something, that she'd been to as a girl. She wanted maybe to settle down a bit. She wanted our children to have a different kind of life from that. But if you think you don't need your spouse's permission to do something like that, you just don't know anything about marriage. If Tanya, my wife, had not wanted to do this or had not let me want to do it, it would have been awful. And I went with some girls that I look back on, and I know if I'd stuck with them, it would have been well, anyway, so I hadn't finished my novel, A Place on Earth. At the time I came back, it would be 3 more years before I did, and I'd been working on it for 4 years. But if I had been rational, maybe I was a little bit, I would have known, and maybe I did a little bit, that wherever I went, my mind had been formed by this little tiny country that I'd grown up in, a few square miles, 10 maybe, and that was going to be my subject, because my emotional life was centered there, and my affection and so on. So I did, and I do remember knowing, well, you're going to go back and bury a lot of people, is what you're going to do. And I think I even knew I was going to bury a lot of people who couldn't be replaced, who could have been replaced in their function, but who wouldn't be because the replacements were gone. And I have. And I've delivered too many eulogies. I've carried too many coffins. No, I shouldn't say that. I've done the things I needed to do to be a member of my community. It's not too many. No number would be too many. But as I've lived here and lived into the place and grown to know it, for one thing, what I've begun to realize, and none of my advisors at the time I was leaving New York City understood this, my place is inexhaustible in interest, in beauty, in events, relationships, and so on. 10 lifetimes couldn't exhaust it. It would be doing something new all the time, something different. And every day I walk in the footsteps, I cross the tracks of people I've known well and loved very much. And that's just indescribably rich. It's layered somehow very deeply. And I don't know how I would have had that otherwise. It's very rewarding, leaving aside what it's caused me to write, which that's an evaluation I just don't want to get into, but it's very moving. And my kids have it. And I hand it on to my grandchildren. I've been working with my grandson since he was this big. And now he's gone off to school, which is a terrible thing to have happened. But I repeat things that I remember people saying for him. I want to get them into his mind. There's a whole set of good sayings with attributions that he's been given. I don't know whether he'll remember them or not, but.
Are your children and grandchildren in this area, or did they?
Yes, that's been the great, you could say good fortune, you could say blessing, but it's actually fairly rare for people to have their children and grandchildren around them. Tanya and I have been able to help raise our grandchildren, which has been a great joy. A very good thing, and they're still involved. My son and my daughter. My son is, completely necessary to me by now. I've got to have him, and he's a willing help. He's good company. We're friends. A great good thing. You ought to fall out with your children, or they ought to fall out with you. They won't grow up otherwise, I don't think. But they've got different minds, and that's just a fact. And their minds and your mind are going to clash, and they ought to. But then, on the other side of that, there's the possibility of friendship with your children, which is a great possibility. Not a very orderly business, this raising children, but amateur work, We've all been raised by amateurs.
Is your farm being plowed with horses?
It isn't being plowed.
Okay.
It's being mowed. Clip the pastures. I clipped the pastures. I did do some plowing, but when my son got established on his farm, and I live in the river valley, and it's hard to get, especially on the times, in the time zone we're in now, the daylight saving time, the dew doesn't dry where I live until afternoon, and small fields, for him to be dragging equipment down there to help me put up feed from my own place, just too much. It's asking too much of him. So he said, I'll raise it. You can buy it from me, and that's the way we do. So, but the getting out firewood out of the woods, an occasional saw log, I use the horses for that, cleaning the barns, clipping the pastures. When I was younger, I'd use them to drive around on, but I don't do that much anymore. And I don't have young ones that need to be driven around. Yeah, I still have a team. I bought his weanlings in 1996, so we're getting old together. But it's lovely. I used to love to work with the young ones because, you know, for the excitement. And I'm really enjoying these old horses. We know each other. They know the place. They know the work, so I kind of rejoice in their experience and knowledge and considerateness of me sometimes. And I've trained my two grandchildren. My grandson and his sister, the two youngest grandchildren. They're my son's children. And we had them underfoot a little bit more than the others, and I taught the grandchildren, those two, to use a mowing machine and a team of horses.
Do you think they'll continue?
I'm sorry?
Do you think they'll continue?
May have to. There's a place for horses in agriculture. And if the cost of fuel increases, as it probably will, they're going to reclaim a certain place, even on non-Amish farms. Be a good thing in some ways. Some people oughtn't to ever work with animals. So it'd be a bad thing in some ways, because inevitably there'll be bad matchups and it'll be bad.
What other animals do you have?
I'm sorry?
What other animals do you have?
I have a border collie, and I've got 23 border Cheviot ewes that ought to be bred. I don't know whether I'll find out, you know. That's about it. I've got 23 bred ewes. I'm going to keep over 7 ewe lambs from last year, and I think I own 3 rams, 2 of which are at home, one's at a neighbor's. And then all kinds of non-commercial creatures.
You still raise tobacco on the farm?
I never raised tobacco on my farm. I've been blamed for it, but no. I worked in tobacco well on into the 80s, I think. I'm not sure exactly when was the last time. I quit when my neighbors quit growing it. But I would go, they'd come to me when I needed help, and I went to them. That old neighborhood is about gone. We're either old or dead, except for my son is the only youngish person, and he's not young anymore. So I was involved, but I never defended the crop. I defended the program. For good reason. It was a model program, and one of the things my daughter's doing in her work is to try to keep alive the idea of that old co-op, which was an exemplary thing for government to do. The people couldn't have done it. They tried it, and they couldn't do it. The problem was, they try to, the only way you can get power if you're a seller is to pool your product and hold it off the market until you can get the price up. But when they'd hold it off the market, always somebody, there were other things involved too, but somebody or several people would simply come to the limit. They had to take what they could get, even if what they got was so little as to compound the trouble they were in. They had to take it. And that it would fall apart. What made the difference was a government loan given against the crop that permitted the grower to receive a check when his crop went into the pool, his or her crop went into the pool, at the warehouse. And you see, that's where the government figured in. And that program is really my answer to people who say, well, we can just get rid of the government. We need the government. We need it specifically to do things for us that we can't do for ourselves. I'm a pacifist, and that immediately gets me into trouble. I'm not a natural pacifist, but I've reached the end of my string on violence. I don't think it works. But feeding hungry people, for instance, is something the government ought to do if nobody else will do it. It ought to do it.
So a lot of us are graduate students in universities, and I'm in the science. So a lot of us are graduate students in sciences, and your writings of critiquing science and industry and all those relationships are things I also feel conflicted about. And I'm curious, what would redeem the university? Is it mainly the specialization? Like if we were talking to more people as students, do you think that would be a good counter to the industrial tendencies of universities, or how do we go about trying to bring some redemption?
Well, the population of universities is not very settled, you know. The students are transients by definition, and the faculty stir about and get offered a drink and $1,000 raise, and off they go. Here's something Wes Jackson and I have talked about at length. Suppose you ask a question like, where are we? Suppose a university addressed itself to a question like that. And then to go ahead, let's make a kind of a curriculum of questions. The next question would be, if you could figure out where you are, what's happened here? What has been the cost of what's happened here? What ought to be happening here? What will nature permit us to do here without damage? What would nature help us to do here? Well, you see, the university wouldn't be a university anymore of the present kind. It would have had to dissolve, because those questions can't be answered in a department. What's happened here? Good gracious. You got to have agronomists, ecologists, biologists of all kinds, mechanical engineers, chemists, folklorists, historians. English department surely could get wedged in somehow. But you see, you'd be having a conversation that would lead to knowledge of a local kind. but it would begin to get these people's heads wrapped in the place and its fate. What would come out of that, I can't predict, but I think it would be wonderful. It would be wonderful to enlarge the context, not necessarily do away with specialized studies. You've got to have specialists within limits. I mean, if you want a brick house built, you want a bricklayer. You don't want somebody who thinks it would be fun to play with bricks for a few weeks. But it would enlarge the context of their thought. And it would enlarge the sense of consequence. So that you begin to realize how people live with consequences and how they make more consequences, for better or worse. Every place they inhabit, they're living with results. And so that's what I think of. West told me once on the telephone that he'd visited a university and he'd kind of wandered around a while by himself, and he saw that it had a library and laboratories, well equipped, classrooms, dining halls, dormitories, and he thought this would be a hell of a good place to have a school.
Barry, I spent several years growing up in a small town in southeastern Ohio, not a lot different from this region. I saw a lot of affection for land, small farms, orchards, coon hunts, trot lines. I also saw in my extended family high rates of alcoholism, abuse, all kinds of dysfunctional problems. Such that many younger members of the family envisioned a different kind of life and went away. In the members of your family that you write about and many of the characters in your stories, the characters seem to possess, some of them anyway, an intrinsic or underlying virtue or character that drives them.
Yeah.
Those problems I've described are still with, and they're very prevalent in the rural communities I live in today. They're around me. Does that still, in your mind, does that virtue still arise only from affection, or does it arise from something else?
I'm not sure how else it would arise if it doesn't arise from affection. I mean, we have it by prescription. Love thy neighbor, do unto others as you would have them to do to you, and those things. Don't kill. Don't steal, and all that. And you can obey them if you. But the real solid, enduring reason would be affection. You don't kill your neighbor because you need him, her. You need a neighbor. Don't forget now that fiction is fiction. One thing I've tried to set myself is the task of writing about some people who struck me as being mainly good people. Because the modern fiction enterprise, has been really interested in stories about people who weren't determined or formed by that impulse toward goodness. Now, there are drunks in my fiction, and murderers, and bad neighbors, and so on, but I don't, that question calls on for some elaboration. First is the real question in my mind: how many communities are still rural communities? Most country people now are city people, actually, who just live in the country. They're consumers. They don't live from the land anymore much. In my community, in the last few years, the neighborhood principle is just gone. The work swapping that went on, the good talk among neighbors that work together is gone. So that's gone. And what they're doing, well, I would say that something really significant has happened to a rural community when it quits telling stories from its memory and starts telling what it saw on television. Something is gone. I know from my friend John Harrod, who's a good student of the fiddle music traditions in Kentucky, every country town had some fiddle tunes or songs that were uniquely its own, along with the repertoire, you know, of classics, Soldier's Joy and those. What has happened when a community has lost its songs, its music, and its stories? We don't know. If you read intellectual magazines like the New York Review of Books, from time to time somebody will throw off on the suffocating provinciality of small towns or the narrow-mindedness of small-town lawyers, something like that. And that again is a kind of it's language is gesture. They don't know what they're talking about. There is such a thing as the famous small-town gossip, and sometimes it can be vicious. But another function of small-town gossip, it tells you who needs help. I mean, that's the way churches, for instance, find out who in the community needs toys at Christmas. Those things. Alcoholism, drugs, they're all out there now, and they're there in the kid culture, the school kid culture. But then I don't know where you would go to escape those things that you listed. The only difference is that people are apt to suffer more intimately in small communities where everybody knows everybody. My community, I had a great uncle who used to say in Port Royal, we don't distinguish the masses from the classes, which is pretty true. But my community's put up with some pretty odd characters, including me. I mean, tolerated actually people who had been institutionalized if they'd been in a big city. They'd have been on the street drunk. Yes.
Mr. Berry, earlier you talked about the tension between emulating, living a life that's a model versus maybe advocating. You just briefly talked about that. And I have a question about emulating, living a life that's, a model. You said often it's embarrassing, or awkward, especially when you're a public figure. So what motivates you to continue doing that? And how do people respond to that, especially when you're working through things in a very public way?
Well, I just have a horror of thinking of myself as a model because I know myself. I've had the bad fortune in some ways to have a public life, but I know that the people I'm talking to in these public occasions, like this one, people don't know me. And the circumstances make them free to think that I'm better than I am. And that's false. And if I got very deeply into it, it would, I think, be damaging to me. I've never liked evangelism. I just, because of the threat to the character of the evangelist, for one thing. It involves talking down, and it involves presumption about the right to evangelize. I back up to the necessity simply of making as much sense as you can, put it out there where it needs to be, where it's asked for, really, and let it get on from there the best it can. To publish is not to ask for readers. It's to offer to accept readers if there are any volunteers. There's special ways in which people can think of themselves as teachers. That is, if they know something that other people don't know, and the other people want to hear it. This takes the idea of being a teacher out of school immediately, of course. But teachers in school know things that the students don't know. How to add and subtract, maybe. How to think about history. Those things, but they do involve a presumption, and sometimes they make people too proud of themselves. I have been under the influence of a lot of people. I've had a lot of teachers, most of them out of school, a lot of them who have had very little education. I've known them well, and I've known the limits to which they could be taken as models. So I'd like to shift the term model to example, and then I'd say that when we're dealing with examples, what we're looking for is what is truly exemplary. But we're not looking probably then at people, we're looking at their accomplishments. This is an exemplary job of work. Or this farm is exemplary because it gives you an example of what can be done, but limited to this place. You can't do on, this is what's wrong with industrial agriculture, you see. It tends to treat every farm as identical. That's why you got the same corn crops and bean crops being grown all over the place. You got to get the scale right. If you go to an Amish farm, you'll see how sensitively the cropping, the economic structure of farms differ one from the other because the terrain differs, fertility differs, exposure to the weather differs. So what's most exemplary is being sensitive to the local circumstances. And there is an analogy here with human relations. I don't know about women. Men begin life as pretty stupid creatures. You know, and especially regarding women. They're egotistical. They can understand perfectly why a woman might love them. But there's a possibility that they can learn something, you see. And what they learn is that people ought to be treated individually with some sensitivity toward what makes them unique. I mean, you don't treat your wife as a typical woman, for God's sake. Sooner or later, you better get over that. So it's the same. You don't treat your farm as if it were a typical or an average or a representative farm. Finally, you leave monologue and you come to conversation with the place, with the person. You talk to other people not with the feeling that they ought to hear what you have to say, but because of your interest in the difference between you and them. Maybe girls begin pretty stupidly too. I don't know. I didn't collect that many examples.
Yeah, one of the most discouraging things of the current state of affairs right now, to me at least, is industry and corporations have so much sway, so much of a voice, and people have so little of a voice. Our universities, government, they're very insidious in our culture. So, and even if 99% of us lived exemplary lives, it would still be there. Such a lobby power. So how do we stand up against this industry juggernaut and fight for the system that is the alternative?
Well, I run in my own mind immediately to the idea of economy as opposed to economics. I think by working on our personal economies, the local economies, family economy, household economy, we can learn to take back, though only maybe a little at a time, the power that we've delegated, the proxies we've given. And if people did that in significant numbers, the power that corporations, governments, and universities have, which is after all our power, would be significantly diminished. How that might happen over years, I don't know. I don't subscribe to this idea that's getting a little too prevalent, that anything you destroy will inevitably be replaced by something better. I think there are people who think that if we could just get rid of this government, something better inevitably would take its place. And these people are conservatives, but Edmund Burke didn't think that way. Burke's great principle was, you can't wipe the slate clean. You have to start with what you've got. And this calls for criticism. This calls for really good general criticism, and that's another place where you can fault the universities. They're not enabling that the way they ought to. But what we need are more people who are capable of authentic criticism of what we've got. And it's not going to be a one-person job. It's going to take all these minds that we've disenfranchised by substituting technologies for them or expert advice for them. To get the use of people's minds restored to them would be a great thing, but that would depend on the emergence of an authentic criticism. And I think authentic criticism can't be yelled. It won't be a bunch of slogans. What I long for, I listen for it all the time, and I long to hear it, is authentic discourse. You can tell the sound of it when you're still too far away to distinguish the words. But it has a sound. You don't get it from these people who are shouting slogans. You're not going to get it from Occupy Wall Street. You're not going to get it from the Tea Party. You're going to get it from thoughtful people who really have furnished their minds with the wherewithal for thought. And so, English departments, for instance, need to teach the literary tradition, the poetic tradition, as if it's something we need, not as something that would be nice ornament conversation at a cocktail party. Something we need. I mean, I will tell you, how are we doing? Let me tell you something else that I've got on my mind in a big way. In the 12th century, a man named Alanus ab Insulis, or Alain of Lille, or Alan of Lille, Alain de Lille, I guess it was. But anyway, Alan wrote a book called The Complaint of Nature. And that book represents nature. It appropriates, apparently, a late Roman deity called Natura. But Alan, in The Complaint of Nature, conceives of nature as the vicar of God. She rules, she makes in the lunar sphere, the sphere of change, mortality, and so on, the change of the mutable creation. That was picked up by at least the second author of the Romance of the Rose in French. Chaucer picked it up from there and from Alan too. Spencer picked it up from Chaucer. Chaucer's treatment is in the Parliament of Fowls, I think. I think that's right, and the Priest's Tale, I think. Spencer really develops the figure in the last cantos, the so-called mutability cantos of the Faerie Queene. There's a big argument about mutability and what mutability means. People were getting worried about it, you know, earthquakes. Movement of the earth, Donne said, brings harms and fears. Men reckon what it did and meant. It was on people's minds. And nature comes to settle the argument. The argument and its settlement probably not of overpowering interest, but the figure of nature really is interesting. She's veiled. It's a little hard to tell whether she's a woman or a man, or male or female. She has an aura or radiance about her like Christ at the Transfiguration. She's our mother, our maker, our judge in the earthly realm. And Spencer says of all the creatures, she knittest each to each. She is of all the equal mother, of all the creatures, the equal mother who knittest each to each as brother unto brother. That's ecology. That's it, right there. Before Shakespeare. Or Spencer was older than Shakespeare. That came on to Milton. If you've ever read Comus, a poem in praise of virginity, people are not lining up these days to read it, but what really concerns Milton in that poem is the use of nature, the use of natural gifts. And he says, or the lady in Comus says, Comus has made the argument, oh, it's all here. We need to use it up. It's ungrateful not to. And she says in response that nature, good cateress, means her provision only to the good who live according to her sober laws and the holy dictate of spare temperance. Well, you can, if you want to really enter that passage, you can just fall into it, the implications of it. Nature means her provision only to the good. Isn't that amazing? And Milton had a reputation of being a Puritan, but he's not interested in temperance as a virtue that'll get you into heaven. He's interested in temperance because it's the guarantee of abundance. If we want to have a sustainable lot of everything, we have to use it temperately. Well, it comes on. When Pope writes about how to garden in the letter to Burlington, Alexander Pope, he says, let nature never be forgot. Consult the genius of the place in all. Well, he's talking about how to make a pleasure garden in a way. But clearly that importance attributed to nature, God's vicar, had held out that far. The Romantics lost it. Nature as the goddess, the vicar of God, the mother, the maker, the judge is gone. Romantic nature poetry is all about alienation from nature. Bird thou never wert, Shelley says to the skylark. Skylark's a symbol. But how wonderful to find that. It took me a long time to find it. I kept wondering where this was coming from. And I still don't know where it comes from ultimately. Where did Alan get it? These things, you know, no one person ever makes up much of anything. That must go far back. Then you find the hints of it, maybe in the tradition of the small farmer that goes way back. It's in the Bible. It's in Homer. It's Virgil had it in a big way. The old Cilician, is that what he was? The old man who had a farm that nobody else wanted, but he did well on it. He didn't envy anybody. Well, I admitted to start with, I didn't have anything to draw on except Christian tradition. And all my life I've been trying to make it serve thought, first of all. And so I'm feeling kind of triumphant about finally learning in the last several years about nature. That existed. It was right there. It made its demands on us. And then we lost it. Well, how did we lose it? We lost it because America was discovered. And all of a sudden, nature seemed inexhaustible. Long distance transportation, folks. It's been the ruin of us.
Mr. Berry, I wondered if I could ask you a question about church. You mentioned being carried off as a boy to church and remembering the hymns of your youth.
Yeah.
Related question, two questions. Is there a hymn that you see Christians singing corporately on Sunday mornings that drives you nuts? Do you think this is
Oh, I don't like those.
the one that you really appreciate?
I don't like the hymns about the military career of Jesus. We used to sing Onward Christian Soldiers all the time, I suppose because of World War II. I'm sure the Germans were singing their version of it. And the Battle Hymn of the Republic just drives me crazy. I think it's perfectly crazy. It's a great tune. But the lyrics are nuts. They're nuts. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Good Lord. Nobody's eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord, and especially not in the Civil War. The Civil War is the most fraught bit of our history. It's all loaded up with various patriotisms and a lot of congratulations about freeing the slaves. It was a great mistake. It had terrible consequences. And it isn't over. That's what's the matter with wars. They don't end. The Crusades aren't over. Somebody's going to remember. Kentucky was really tragically divided. Families. It really was a civil war here. And after the armies went south, after the Battle of Perryville, I think, Bragg took his army south. This state was occupied by the Federal Army. There was a general named Burbridge who did monstrous things, reprisal killings. I mean, he'd take hostages and put them in jail so they'd have them there in case, if John Hunt Morgan passed through the state again, they'd take some of them and kill them. Kids hanged, that is to say. There was a federal military prison in Louisville. I have a manuscript or a copy of one that came out of that prison. I've never read anything in books about it, but it was Guantanamo. Well, you said anything that could be construed as unfriendly to the Union, they could clap you in there. There was no due process. No probable cause even. The way you got out was by connections, if you had any. And in Kentucky, the violence went on. One thing you must understand is the legitimate violence breeds illegitimate violence. So what do we have? Not too far from here, in the east end of my county and parts of Owen County, which is the adjoining two counties to Carroll, where you are now, they killed 100 people in the 70s. A lot of them black, some of them white, because they had night riders and regulators and Ku Kluxers and what have you. Reprisal, vengeance, neighbors, getting even with neighbors for offenses. It went on, some historians say, until the Goebel assassination in 1900, when William Goebel was elected governor and immediately shot. Some people say it went on later than that. I'd say it's still going on. How do we get on that? I'm glad we did. Oh, yeah.
What is there a song you like to sing?
Oh, I love to sing, or I love to hear sung. I love that song at the cross, near the cross, because I heard a black man sing it, and a black man the funeral of a black man I loved. He sang it like nobody ever sang it in my hearing before. Rock of Ages, there's several of those old good ones. Isaac Watts, he's a pretty consistent performer, I think.
Well, so some of us here are involved with like seeking out solutions to agriculture and environmental problems, and in some of your stuff, you're a bit pessimistic about solutions. And I was wondering if you could comment on whether you see greater benefit from increased seeking out scientific understanding, or you think the benefit might be rather turning our interest towards community development and then allowing natural development of knowledge out of that.
First, our impulse, being the people we are, is to see that we have a big problem and then rush off to find a big solution. Global warming or climate change, for instance, is it's bundling little problems having to do with waste and pollution and so on, irresponsibility, into one big problem that nobody can really address as an individual. And then what happens is it gets moved off into the future, and we're planning now about, or some people are, what you do in the future. I love that verse in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6:34, isn't it? Take no thought for the morrow. The fact is that nobody caused this movement toward farmers markets, community-supported agriculture farms, local food economies, which is very advanced, comparatively very advanced in Louisville region. I mean, it's been going for a while. Lots of problems, but it's going. Nobody caused that. It has been very little reported, but the increase of it is just astonishing over about the last 10 or 15 years. So that's a good change, I think. It's a good movement. I wrote an essay once called In Distrust of Movements, and I maintain my distrust, but so far that's a good movement. I'm in on it. I'm helping. I endorse it. Now there is some point in addressing it at the level of policy. And I have been to Washington with Wes Jackson and Fred Kirschenman to promote the what we call the 50-year Farm Bill, which would invert the ratio of 20% of the farmland in perennials to 80 in annuals. To the 50-year Farm Bill would change that in 50 years to 80% perennials to 20% annual. More people know about it all the time. I don't know what to predict about it. I'm not under any illusions about it. But the fix that we're in is that we do have a big problem, but it doesn't have any big solution. The 50-year Farm Bill would help. If certain people in public office and so on approved of that, it would give a kind of permission to other people to do. We know that's true. Nevertheless, it'll have to be solved farm by farm, farmer by farmer, consumer by consumer. It'll be solved in urban gardens, abandoned lot farming. Lots of little things will have to be done. It'll require patience. It'll take a long time. It's a terrible cross to bear to have to be patient in an emergency, but that's our burden now. Find out what good work is. Do it. Somebody asks you about it, tell them what you're doing. Don't go to your neighbors and say you're wrong. That ain't going to help. I guarantee you it won't help. That's what gave us the Civil War.
I think we have time for one more question. Paul, do you?
I was curious, we've talked about, this is related to problems and solutions, I guess, but talked about the need to be critical and to clearly articulate big problems. But I also appreciate that your work often communicates hope. And I wonder on a practical level how you've chosen to live that balance out and not be dualistic and be critical but not pessimistic. And what does that look like?
Because I'm weak, I can't bear to live without hope. And I've just bothered and wallered these problems until I could see. I've done it over and over again. And I've spent some pretty low moments. But I'm looking for ways to bail it out, to save it after all. And this is an intellectual exercise. I'm very limited intellectually, but that's what it is. It involves thinking your way through it, hunting the good examples. I spent a lot of time when I was better able to stand it, hunting up good farms, good farmers. They exist. Good examples exist. Neighborly people exist. People who are willing to do the work of neighborliness. That's a very serviceable word. I like it because the Christians haven't worn it out. It belongs to them, but they've not bothered it too much, you know. Or they fall into the trap of loving your neighbor passively. Well, I'll sit over here and love you while you get your hay in. Well, I think, you know, heaven is a result. Dante said, we get there by grace and preceding merit. I love that. I love the preceding merit part. You know, you ought to have to do something to deserve it. And I think you ought to be grateful enough for the heavenly things of the world to know them well, and that'll, you know, motivate you. Well, maybe it's like this, you say. Well, yeah, it sounds like a good idea if I could have some choice about my entertainment there. But
and if I can just, one last thing. Mary Oliver writes, when I go to the woods, I normally go alone. And my guess is that on Sundays when you head to the woods, you're usually by yourself. If we became a good enough friend that you were willing to take us into the woods with you, what would you delight to show us?
I couldn't do it. I couldn't show you if the things that I would most delight. If I took you to the woods, the first thing I'd do as soon as I could get rid of you would be go back by myself. But I'll tell you, it all depends on becoming quiet. I believe in inspiration. I mean, that's what's, insofar as I'm a man of religion or faith, it's because I believe in inspiration. I mean, I think that things come to you that you're not smart enough to think up for yourself. I think that's happened to me. Did I say that? Where'd that come from? I'm not smart enough to say a thing like that. So if you get quiet enough, that leads to patience. If you're going to depend on inspiration, Milton called it the heavenly muse, you know. I don't bother the muse. If she leaves me alone, I leave her alone. But if she gives me something, then I'm willing to take it and work hard on it to try to be worthy of it. But what inspiration will teach you is you've got to be patient. If you take the reins, you snatch the reins out of inspiration's hands and take them in your own, you're going to go wrong. So if you're dependent on inspiration, you got to wait. You got to wait. And you got to be willing not to be inspired anymore. You got to be willing to quit. All right, Muse, we've had it. It's been great. I still love you. But
well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you. Well, you've given me a very friendly conversation, and I appreciate it. You've let me off lighter than you should have, I expect.